This is a small cleaver from Galaxy. It's made in China. It's probably the most affordable out of all the inexpensive kitchen knives because it sells locally for around $1 regular price. Some of the kitchen knives that I have used so far in the inexpensive series have been about $1 or $2, but most of them were sort of on sale, bargain bins, dollar store type deals. But this actually sells locally for about $1. So it is pretty much one of the more basic offerings you can get. A couple of things were quite surprising. One was the initial sharpness was moderate in both push cutting and slicing aggression. It wasn't over buffed. Now there were some inconsistencies along the edge. Some parts of it were sharper than others. But the vast majority of North American kitchen knives and even a lot of other knives tend to be over buffed, which rounds the edge completely. And you end up with an edge that, while it sort of pushes into something with a decent amount of sharpness, if you try to draw it along it, it has almost no inherent slicing aggression. This one had. Again, moderate in both respects. The edge thickness is around 15 thou, which is not exceptionally thin, but not exceptionally thick, and sort of makes sense for a sort of light purpose medium cleaver. Not strictly regulated to just light vegetables and meat, but not strictly meant for bones either, sort of middle of the road. The edge angle was around 19 to 20 degrees per side, which is quite heavy for a kitchen knife, but again, this is a cleaver. Now, initially when I was using it, performance was decent for what you would expect for the stock thickness and edge grind. A couple of problems immediately though. The heel of the blade right here, very sharp. The spine right here, very sharp. For a lot of cutting, you don't really notice that because you're either doing a grip back here or you're doing a grip up on the blade like this pinch style, and you don't notice either one of those. But if you do a sharp grip where your index finger is pressed against this, or you're pinching down on the blade where your index finger is wrapped across the spine, you can really notice these are high pressure points. Very easy to fix. Just take some sandpaper or a stone around this, sandpaper or a stone around that. It has a large enough grip for a full hand of large to moderate size. And beyond that, no real concerns with grip ergonomics. Now, you're not going to see the refinements that you got on more expensive knives. For example, the transition from handle to blade is relatively sharp in this area. It doesn't flow very well. And all of these little transitions are relatively squarish. They're not fully rounded off and comfortable. But again, some coarse sandpaper, say 36 or 50 grit, and you'd round all of these off. So right now, if you do a pinch grip sort of up around on the handle, you do get all these little sort of contact points. But again, 36 to 50 grit sandpaper would round all that off. In regards to edge retention, using this as just the one knife in the kitchen, it lasted for around 6 weeks before I had to sharpen it. And at that point, it wouldn't cut a tomato, just back and forth, dead draws. That's again about moderate to performance so far, and falls in line with most of the other inexpensive kitchen knives. Sharpening it, it grinds very easily, which you would expect. The cheapest stone easily grinds into the steel, and this is probably a CR 15 class steel. However, the initial sharpness was rather low, about 25% of optimal, and the first edge retention run that I did on cardboard was also rather low. This is obviously type 1 or class 1 steel in regards to long-term edge retention on abrasive media like cardboard, but it was sort of on the lower end of that. Now immediately when that happens, you sort of want to jump to the conclusion, well, it's the steel, it's faulty, it's full of inclusions, it's just a low-grade cheap steel, or the thermal processing from the factory, it's not properly normalized, not properly rolled, or when they heat treated it, maybe they didn't do that very well, and it's over-soaked, or it's under-quenched, or it's not properly tempered, blah, 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 blah. That's sort of the first thing. It's the problem with the knife. But there's lots of reasons why that your first initial sharpening mightn't reveal the full 100% use of the knife. So like I said, it was around 25% of optimal after the first sharpening. The next sharpening was around 50% of optimal. That's a huge jump, and that to me is a very good sign, because what it shows is that most likely you got a bit of heat damage along the edge, and that you'll get decent performance after a few sharpenings. I don't think this will ever get to the capability of, say, this knife from Spyderco, which is an MBS 26, and pretty much as you would expect. It's approaching top of the line in most respects for production knives in regards to the steel and thermal processing of the steel. It's probably not going to reach there, but it should be able to get to, I don't know, say 75% of the ability to sharpen to a high sharpness as the Spyderco, I'm assuming. And right now I'm still talking about sort of medium fine finishes, 600 grit DMT, fine India stone. That's where I normally leave knives, sort of about this sort of class. Now, in regards to the general shape of the blade, it was one of the few knives I've seen so far of this class, relatively inexpensive, that had a continuous smooth curvature. Most of them have a series of flats, which you'll end up having to blend together to get a curvature, and all you do, of course, is you take the knife and you gently rock it on a stone like this, cutting into the stone to create that nice smooth arc. But this one came with it anyway, so when you are doing rocking cuts on a cutting board, you get nice smooth continuous cuts. And again, keep in mind, this is like a $1 knife if you buy it locally. This little section near the tip where it's nicely arced, again, gives you a bit of a slicing or skinning type motion, which was very nice on chickens and other type meats when I needed it, and doesn't have that sort of abrupt squarish point that's found on some cleavers, which also can be useful. It just depends on what you want it to be used for. Now, my initial sort of concern while I was using this was, when would I really want this cleaver over something like this from Spyderco, which is a santoku, which is a blend of a cleaver sort of and a chef's knife. And of course, what you have with a santoku is a more generous belly generally towards the tip, and an actual point that you can use for, well, point work, for penetration and starting cuts. And in general, I found that this is the style of knife that I would want. I'd actually back off to a full chef's knife. I don't do that much cleaver work, but this is one of the nicer santokus that I've used. What I found is that the main benefit to a full cleaver like this is it gives you essentially the maximum amount of edge that you can use for thicker cutting work. So for example, if you have a santoku like this very edge of the tip, this very top protruding part, of course, is relatively thin because there's not much metal there. So when you're doing very deep cuts through very thick material, like watermelons and very dense squash and stuff like that, you can warp or bend the tip depending on how close your cuts are. And of course, the belly up here will also keep this off the cutting board, so you won't make full length or full depth cuts. So the cleaver essentially gives you the longest edge that you can get for a functional blade length to make those longer cuts. So when you're cutting up cabbage and stuff like that that's relatively wide, you can make full cuts with a shorter blade if you have this type of profile, which is kind of interesting. And like I said, it also keeps the tip at the same thickness, so you're not going to have any issues with the tip itself warping or bending if you slightly go off in a cut. The other thing, of course, is this tip, as you want to call it, this flat chisel type portion up here, is very strong compared to your tip on your santoku or chef's knife. So you can very easily take this and pound it into frozen foods and sort of prime apart, and you have almost no risk of warping or bending. And the same thing, you can use the secondary point back here as sort of an impact point to break certain things if you need to. So overall, what I found with this basically is it was a sort of knife that fell in between. I mean, it's nowhere near close to an actual heavy cleaver, which is what some people imagine when they see cleaver. They think on something like this from Aranyik, which is what people think. This is what cleaver means. But of course, cleaver is a much more general term. There's a lot of different styles of knives. I'm really looking forward to using this one. It's my one knife in the kitchen. It's going to be quite entertaining. But the Eastern style cleavers, and this is another Chinese cleaver, this is a forged one in carbon steel, tend to be like knives in terms of use for cutting rather than often Western style cleavers, which are chopping type tools. So I found that this works very well for most vegetable and fruit work. It also worked well for chicken and most meat work, but it's a bit heavier than the actual cleavers that are meant just for that. This is a much thinner cleaver in regards to the edge profile. It's a full grind from spine basically to edge with no secondary edge bevel, so it has a taper and then it has a bit of a curvature down here to basically increase the cross section right near the edge. So the Galaxy can't approach that in terms of cutting ability, but the thicker edge on the Galaxy and the thicker initial angle allows it to do more bone work without care. Now, so for example, you can chop the knuckles off of chickens. You can easily cut through the leg and the thigh without being very precise about where the cuts are made. I wouldn't go up to turkeys and try to bash through the bones on them because you'd most likely ripple the primary grind. You don't have the cross section there for that. But again, also we can easily stake up a lot of fish. You can cut the heads off larger cod and salmon and of course trout with no ill effects. So it's an in-between sort of knife. And again, it's $1. In regards to corrosion resistance, I would expect this to be extremely corrosion resistant. It's never been oiled, and it's been left in the kitchen exposed to fruit acids for the entire time that I've prepared meals, sometimes for about an hour, never been cleaned, just rinsed at the end. It's been left wet overnight, and there's no spotting or staining on it. But again, this is most likely 3CR15 class steel, so it should be very corrosion resistant. And at some point in the future, I am going to be doing some dishwasher cycles on some kitchen knives and check and see what the corrosion resistance would be in sort of an extreme environment. The only thing I will say that's a slight negative, if you look at the width of the edge bevel on this side, it's slightly higher than the width of the edge bevel. I'm talking about the secondary, or sort of apex bevel, is thinner on this side. And the reason being, of course, that the primary or hollow grind isn't as deep on this side as it is on this side. So when you apply the same edge angle to both sides, they end up being much wider. So it's slightly asymmetric. Now maybe if you're very skilled and very particular, you can pick up the effect of that, because it will add an asymmetry to the cut, because of course the bevel is different on both sides. But I really couldn't notice anything significant when I was cutting, and that's a relatively minor effect. And if you wanted to actually fix it, you would just take a stone and you would plane down this primary grind to make the secondary apex bevel the same width on both sides, and that would remove the asymmetry.